Good morning. Welcome to London, and welcome to probably the hottest day that London has had since 1976, so you'll probably be grateful for the air conditioning that is in this building, because being outside is going to be hard work. Hopefully it's going to be hot for other reasons, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to King's Place and to what is part of the London EdTech Week. And for us, this is a big new step in terms of expanding the concept which Benjamin and I first got involved in some years ago, and we now have an event which extends throughout the whole week, and it's already started, and some of you may have been to some of the events that have already occurred. The exciting bit for us, it's really about how to bring together kind of inspiration and kind of innovation and the industry all together to be able to share kind of the knowledge that we all have. The exciting bit for us is really just the size and involvement of people. And every year we've seen expansion of EdTechX. And with London EdTech Week, as you can see, although it's the first edition, we're expecting over 6,000 people during the course of the week, which makes this now a real hub for the development and ideas within EdTech, both as it relates to education but also to training. And it's also a global gathering. There's over 62 different nationalities that will be appearing, both in terms of presentations and speakers and in terms of attendees. So it's really a hub now for really generating the ideas and opportunities for the coming years within the digital transformation that we see. So part of that is obviously about connecting. And in terms of connecting, then please use some of the Twitter kind of handles that we've got, at EdTech Europe, hash EdTechX 17, which I'll go through in a bit more in terms of some of the other handles. But it's about connection. So please don't just connect on social media, also connect individually through the networking sessions that we have. So let me just hand over to Benjamin, who will explain why this is an auspicious day for us.
Good morning, everyone. Today is an auspicious day because not only is the hottest day of the year in the UK, but it's also Europe's largest concentration of influencers, innovators, and investors in EdTech. And it's also a very important day for us because that's our 5th anniversary. So we decided to throw a pretty large party. There's going to be 870 people today coming from 62 nationalities, more than 100 speakers, more than 40 hours of content. So study your program because it goes quickly and it goes fast and it's packed. We'll have 20 innovation showcase across 4 tracks, 2 awards, 1 cocktail, and 1 party. All this in one day. And that's on top of the London EdTech Week and the field trips that you had yesterday.
So, of course, these type of events are very dependent on the support that we get out of the industry. And we'd like to say, obviously, a big thank you to our sponsors. And I'd like to single out TESS, particularly because they have been with us from the very beginning, incredibly supportive of what we've tried to create. And as a result of that, it's built into what you can see today. Obviously, there are lots of others who support us, and you can see some of the brands here, and you'll see them out in the foyer and elsewhere throughout the day. So a big thank you to them. In terms of the shape of today, obviously Benjamin has mentioned there's a lot going on. You will have your agenda guides, and you'll have the Bizzaboo app, and there are already people in Hall 2, and welcome to them as well, who are being transmitted this stage directly into Hall 2 at the moment. But there are 4 main tracks going on during the course of the day. We've got Now and Next here in Hall 1. We've got Benjamin will be leading off with the international EdTech perspectives in Hall 2. And then we've got the St. Pancras room where there's interactive workshops, and the Battle Bridge room where we'll have the All-Stars during the course of the day. That leads into looking, you'll find innovation showcases being exhibited around the building. And then there's also a live pitch going on during the course of the day as well, which will lead to an award being granted this evening. And then, of course, as Benjamin mentioned, there is the cocktails reception, both for London EdTech Week and also for this event today. So as I mentioned, there's obviously the kind of Twitter handles. Those who haven't signed up for the Wi-Fi, if you look on, you'll find there's a connection which says EdTech on terms of one of the connections. The actual code is Love EdTechX. Notice the two E's just in case when you type it in, but that should work. Handing over to Benjamin and to lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. So let's start with what we called warm-up insights. And the reason it's called warm-up insight is because we want you to start sharing insight and connect from the very first hour of today. So what I suggest we do as a start to break the ice is just to acknowledge the person that sits next to you. Just say hi and shake hands, just for 1 minute. That's it. Thank you very much.
You don't know what you've started.
Thank you, thank you. So, thank you, that's enough. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, thank you very much. It always takes longer than I think. So, 5 years in EdTech, it's been 5 years that we are running this conference. And, for the past 5 years, I've heard very often from innovators and investors in the sector that EdTech is slow, that EdTech is slower than other tech industries such as fintech, health tech, AdTech, and you name it. And it's true in some extent, but that doesn't really matter, because what really matters is that in 5 years, education has changed more than in 2,000 years. And so, we thought as an opening keynote that we would like to look at what are what we call the 5 trends driving and transforming education and training, which are digitization, personalization, privatization, automation, and globalization, and look at those trends and where we were 5 years ago and where we are today. So let me start with digitization. So, back in 2012, for our first edition, I remember we had the chief digital officer of a very large education company. I won't name the company, but just to give you a hint, it starts with a P, and it ends with son. And I remember this guy telling us, we are the largest digital education company in the world. We are leader in educational e-books. And that was the mindset at the time. Content is king, and EdTech equal e-books. Similarly, back in 2012, people were talking about MOOCs and were skeptical about it, claiming poor content, low engagement, education on the chip, sometimes, with a bit of a condescending tone, that's education for the emerging markets. And the idea that MOOCs could challenge university was at the time unthinkable. Back in 2012, when you were thinking about digitalization in the classroom or digital equipment in the classroom, you were thinking about whiteboards and ICT labs full of Microsoft computers. Back in 2012, AR, VR, artificial intelligence were not even on the map. They were barely a gimmick. And so the world has changed very much in 5 years, because in 2017, we start to see the platforms becoming more powerful than the content creators. The value proposition of universities is much less compelling compared to alternatives such as MOOCs or bootcamps, for example. Google Chromebooks and their softwares are taking over the classroom in the US, and AR and VR are also very much well considered now across all the spectrum from K to 12 to corporate training. So let me dig a little bit into this. And let me start with the rise and the dominance of the platform, which is, déjà vu and no surprise. Because in every content-led industry, digitization triggers a very well-known sequence, a sequence of shift of power between content and platforms. And usually digitization creates content profusion, which creates confusion, which creates a need for curation, and which creates a need for platforms. And those platforms tend to become dominant players by using 2 levers. what we call programmatic curation, using adaptive software to recommend content, and social curation, leveraging communities and social networks to recommend content. So, and you've got examples here of iTutor Group and Coursera, for example, being large platforms in the EdTech industry. And in 2012, for those who were here at our very first conference, Charles and I had predicted that it will take 5 years for MOOC's platform to surpass the biggest education brands in higher education. And some of you may remember this graph, but here you go. So we've compared, that's basically Google search. We compared Coursera, Oxford, and Cambridge. And from a search and interest standpoint, it took 5 years for Coursera to catch up with 800 years of history. And what's interesting, and some people might say, well, they don't monetize well, but that's not the point. There is certainly engagement here, and in a very short amount of time. So education moves fast, and EdTech moves faster than we think. And what's interesting is, where is that happening? And if you look at, Coursera, they're basically dominant in North American BRICS, which you would consider the market with the most potential. So, that's a huge change in 5 years. And another 2017 tipping point in digitization is the intensity of competition between Google, Microsoft, and Apple. Competition to take over the classroom. And this is what Google is doing right now much better than others, taking over the leadership of Microsoft, not only with devices, but also with softwares. And that's another tipping point, is that we start to hear in schools, not only people wondering about what devices they should use, but much more about what software matters. And that's a huge shift in mindset that was not existing, I think, 5 years ago. So, together with intense competition from those tech giants, I think all the stars are aligned for a much faster adoption. Let me now move to personalization. So 5 years ago, state-of-the-art personalization was pretty much equal to new teaching techniques, such as flip the classroom, or new forms of content, which we call courseware, adaptive content. And at the time, the focus of personalization was very much on the what, on the curriculum and on subjects of the curriculum, on the knowledge, on the what we learn. In 2017, we start to see bots acting as teacher assistants or tutors and delivering personalized learning. In 2017, largely inspired by learning science and neuroscience, and the combination of the two is what I call neuroeducation, we start to see a shift towards the how we learn, and how each of us is a different learner as opposed to the what we learn. So let me dig into this. You've got here a fascinating example of innovation that was not even on the map 5 years ago. That's a virtual teacher assistant at Georgia Tech, powered by IBM Watson. And the crazy thing is that students used it for 5 months without noticing that this lady, Jill Watson, she's called, was a robot. So if 2012 was flip the classroom, 2017 is bot the classroom. And that brings, I guess, the topic of what's education in the age of artificial intelligence. Because what's learning in a world where access to knowledge and intelligence is no longer limited? If you think of it, competing with machines in the field of scientific knowledge will become quickly irrelevant. So, what do we do with human intelligence? I mean, seriously, what's the purpose of it, right? Should we trash it? Should we apply it to gaming or virtual reality, or should we refocus it? And refocusing it is an approach that Finland is taking by deprioritizing, subject matters, and instead focusing on what we call subjects and, projects and phenomena-based learning. So what does that mean in the context of a classroom? So for example, instead of studying the subject of earth science, instead, let's try to tackle the phenomena of global warming as a group project. And that's a fundamental shift, a shift towards the how we learn. And why is that shift a must? Well, if you think of it, education as an institution in charge of lifelong transfer of knowledge and skills is about to become obsolete. First, because knowledge and skills depreciate much faster as a result of the pace of innovation in our societies. And second, because knowledge is starting to become widely available from artificial sources. So focusing on how we learn as opposed to what we learn is probably the future of education. And that's precisely what neuroeducation is about. It won't be long before we ask our educators to move away from transmitting and managing knowledge. And instead, we may want our educators to become what I call brain farmers, using learning science to seed motivation for learning and creativity. In other words, maximizing the potential of the human brain. So let's see in 5 years.
So this is all very well, but then there comes the question of how are we going to pay for it? And that is obviously one of the big challenges that we face as a society, both in developed and also, obviously importantly, in the emerging markets as well. And back in 2012, then, what we were talking about was really the balance between private funding, so from personal resources or from corporates in the training market, versus state provision. And we knew it was an issue, but we didn't have many solutions. What's interesting now in 2017 is that we're starting to see some of the ideas of how to cope with a vastly changing marketplace. So we're starting to look at how to address the issues about teacher shortage. We're looking at the skill gaps that exist in the market, and we're looking at how to fund education and training in different ways to the ones we've been used to in the past. So what's clear in terms of this analysis is that the existing structure just doesn't work, and it's very easy to see why. And the reason being is that first, if we start with just the number of students that are expected to be in the market, if you add in the fact that the years of schooling are likely to increase, and you add in the fact that we've got emerging markets and developing world that's adding to the desire and hunger for education, we expect 1 billion more students to be entering into the market, or just on the education side. If you add to that, on top of that, the fact that the workplace needs to retrain for the new skills that are being developed, we've got a further 1 billion workers that need to be retrained. That structure that we have at the moment just cannot cope with that level of demand for new skills to be brought into the workplace and into the schools. So we've got a real challenge ahead of us. And part of today and the week that we have in terms of London EdTech Week is about trying to come up with ideas and solutions for these challenges. The teacher shortage is something that is kind of very obvious. Even the United Nations warns that in order to provide universal education to the world, that the world would require 69 million teachers. That's in terms of, just in terms of primary schools, that's 25 million of teachers just for primary schools. It's not going to happen this way. There's just no way that the world can supply that level of skilled workers to provide the education needs. So we have a real challenge ahead of us. And together with that challenge, we also have a challenge as it relates to the skills that are in the workplace. And I read a report which fascinated me, which is just as it related to the OECD, which it said that 200 million workers in the OECD don't have basic foundation skills. Basic foundation skills is the reading age of a 10-year-old. Now, that's just in the OECD. So we have, just in terms of basic skills, we've got a real problem. Employers say that they cannot find the skills that they require. Employees themselves feel that there's a mismatch to the skills that they have and the workplace. If you put those two together, it's been estimated that the risk to the world in terms of from a value perspective is $10 trillion of GDP. So financially, we have a huge challenge ahead of us. So as we look at that, then the question for us is about how do we address these problems. So what can actually be done? And that's also for all of us to look at. But in terms of what we see two kind of narratives that are developing. One is looking at alternative education, so responding to that demand that's in the marketplace by providing alternative supply. And that's coming in the form of boot camps for providing specific training in specific areas. It's about low-cost education, so you've got people like Bridge International that are delivering education at $6 a month, which is just bringing the base cost way down. On the alternative funding side, we're starting to see novel structures that are coming in. And in a sense, what's happening is people are trading their future income for paying for education today. And so even within kind of higher ed within the States, there is already an established market where essentially you can give up part of your future income. It's also happening in coding skills. And there's an example where you can effectively get coding skills for free if you hand over 12% of your income post-training for 2 years. So these types of new models are emerging. Then the question is, if we do all this retraining, is there going to be a job for us at the end of it? Because there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, automation, and what that will do. And back in 2012, we looked at that in the context of the impact on unemployment, the impact in terms of lifelong learning, in terms of trying to retrain. But again, we weren't sure how we were going to solve these challenges. In 2017, we're seeing the impact of automation. We're seeing how it's displacing jobs. We're also starting to see some of the solutions in terms of bringing down training into kind of bite-sized elements that people can actually access. And there are models that are coming out there, both digitally delivered, but also in terms of things like face-to-face with boot camps and in terms of hybrid solutions. So we're starting to see that. But, you know, there's some real issues, as we know. Robotics and artificial intelligence are the topic of virtually every newspaper today. Robotics have been rising over the course of the last decade, 72% rise in industrial robots, and a consequence of a fall in manufacturing jobs. And it's estimated that 45% of jobs in the US will be replaced by some form of automation. So the race is on. The race against obsolescence, human obsolescence. And so the question for us is, as we look at the pyramid of different skills in the marketplace, we have at the top of the pyramid what we call the super educated. And they're largely insulated because there are always going to be a smaller group of jobs and availability for those that are super educated. The interesting element for us is the middle section, which is the ones that have to respond and essentially be uber trained, being capable to be flexible and respond to this changing marketplace. And then the last section is the bit, how do we deal with the worry of robotics displacing a large section of the workforce? And in that particular arena, then, as we look at the training that's required, is trying to draw people into the uber-trained market. And that is a kind of a sense of being able to bring together the network effect of a digital environment and use that to be able to allow people to provide their services into a much more flexible environment. And so we start to talk about ideas of the human cloud, about being able to use the cloud to connect people through work rather than just through the delivery of products and services. And so that market, we estimate, is going to be one that grows substantially. In the US, there is already a huge freelance economy, and our sense is that will grow and grow. And on the education side, we start to see things like nano degrees, which are going to be able to help train people. Young people today are likely to have 17 jobs over their life, over 5 different careers. That is a very different world to the world that we exist in, or our parents have existed in before us. So we have the rise of the de-skilled and displaced, the useless class. Now, it's not all bad news, because there are examples. So, for example, GE, in terms of its aviation unit in Canada, talked about how it replaced its workforce with robotics. But what was interesting was that productivity went up. It went up 25%, and that 25% increased productivity drew in new jobs into the industry. And so, although they used to employ 600 people, they brought in robotics, productivity went up, they now employ 900 people. But different jobs, creative jobs, skilled jobs, computer-skilled jobs. So it's about learning soft skills. So if we're going to save the useless class, it's about giving those new skills into the workplace.
So let's talk about globalization for the past 5 years. So if you think of it, 2012, in the context of globalization, education was mostly about brands and technology from the West. And in the context of globalization, education was considered as an export product. 2017, we start to talk much more about demand from the East and the South with countries such as Africa, China, and ASEAN markets. We also talk in the context of globalization of EdTech as a competitive advantage for competitiveness in the knowledge economy. So, up till now, the most visible aspect of globalization of education was brands and technology from the West trying to meet demand from the East and the South. And one stat will tell you everything. 90% of the growth in student enrollment is coming from Asia, 200 million, and Africa, 100 million, 90%. So you start to have examples here of Western brands opening offshoots or franchise in other countries and emerging markets. You have the example here of St. Alban, who's opening in Dubai. That's a brand that exists since 946. You've got Eton launching a digital ventures in China called EdTechX. We'll have the CEO of EdTechX today. And by and large, Asia is driving international demand for school. And there's going to be many more like this because globalization of education brands is happening at lightning speed. And I believe that education will soon have its global franchise in the same way that fashion, for example, that is Zara's on one hand and Louis Vuitton on the other side. And a couple of other stats which are, I think, striking is there is today in the world one international school for every 3 Starbucks. But we don't see them because most of them are in Asia or in Middle East. And the number of those international schools is going to double over the next 10 years. International curriculum, such as the International Baccalaureate, is the fastest growing curriculum in the world. So, the key question is how long that window of opportunity for Western education brands will last. And our view is that it won't last very long because while they were absent 5 years ago, we start to see education technology brands emerging from the East as well. 5 years ago, we were not talking about Singapore math. 5 years ago, we were not talking about China becoming a superpower of EdTech. So let's talk a little bit about China. China is bullish on EdTech. And China, and this is first, and few people know that, it's an education system that copies with pride other countries' best practices, namely Finland. And if you combine this with strong work ethics, you have what I call a killer combo. This is also 8 billion in terms of size of the digital education market. That's growing 50% per year. It's an ecosystem of 9,500 EdTech companies, between 2 and 3 times the size in Europe. That's already 15 unicorns, EdTech unicorns, when Europe has none. And that's 30 to 40% of the global EdTech venture investment. And that's also, and we tend to forget about this, since the end of the single-child policy, a booming early years market with 20 million newborns each year. Can you imagine the scale of this in terms of numbers of nurseries and coding schools? That's twice the amount of newborns in Europe and America. So, and it's not only about China. And in our view, the new world, by and large, is much better positioned to become the promised land of digital education and EdTech. And for a couple of reasons. First, emerging markets have a digital supremacy. There are more people connected to the internet in emerging market than in the old world. They also have a youth supremacy. 90% of the population under 30 years old live in those emerging markets. So by and large, the education of young population is an emerging market. There is probably faster digital transition because there is less inertia from established infrastructure in those markets. There is also a form of learn-to-earn hunger because in those countries, education has a strong ROI. It delivers life-changing outcomes. And this learn-to-earn hunger is also fueled by one of the biggest growth opportunity in capitalism history, which is the $30 trillion consumer spend by 2025. So emerging market, watch them out, watch China as well, and let's not rest on our laurels with our Western brands and technology, because things will change fast. That was, a 5-year view on 5 trends. We'd like to spend a few minutes now on what we call the longer view.
So I guess the question that we all face is as Benjamin said, is where does this all go now? What's the long view for education and training? And probably the best guide that we have as we look at that is probably just looking at the past as the best that we have in terms of what's happened elsewhere. And so we just wanted to look briefly at what the patterns have been in terms of industry transformation and how those might relate to the education and training markets. So if you look at various sectors in terms of hospitality, automotive, entertainment, retail markets, what you notice is that the pattern has been very much of an industry that's consolidated. It's then globalized as the brand or service is reached internationally. And then there's been a digital reinvention of that proposition. So you can see that in terms of Hilton versus Airbnb, Toyota to Tesla, Time Warner to Netflix, and Walmart to Amazon. And these processes are interesting because they've been sequential. So it's been a pattern that's been able to follow, and the incumbents have been able to adjust and reinvent themselves. As we look at education, that's the challenge that we face, because it's a fragmented market. We don't have these old brands in the same way that have consolidated and then globalized and then digitally reinvented. The only place that we're probably starting to see some of that digital reinvention is in the higher ed in terms of big brands that, like Benjamin's mentioned, with Coursera and edX. And so we have a simultaneous transformation of how do we create brands in a digital environment that are going to be global and going to be recognized and get consolidation to get the benefits of those scale, and also being able to provide funding models that work with that. We are challenged with the fact that we have to do all of this simultaneously, and therein also lies the opportunity. So we see ourselves having to reinvent the whole form of education and training. The good news is that although education is under-digitized as it compares to other industries like content, where you can see that 35% of the content industries have already been digitized, education is at a very small level by comparison, at 2.5%. Over the coming years to 2020, which is only 3 years off, we expect another 120 billion spend in education. And although that is still very small compared to other industries in terms of digital impact, the actual spend, just because of the size of the market, is dramatic. So we think there is hope because the money is there to drive that change. And that is what we're doing today and over this coming week to help make that happen.
The very long view now. Charles and I believe, and not only us, by the way, that education technology is to become the economic driver of the 21st century. And so if you put things in perspective, pre-industrial economy was about cultivation and extraction to maximize food and resources. Industrial economy was about manufacturing and services to maximize consumption and profit. And the knowledge economy, in our view, is about education and artificial intelligence. And to maximize what? To maximize human potential. And EdTech is at the heart of it. EdTech is at the heart of human potential, and that's why we love EdTech. Thank you very much.